In the past few weeks, Blizzard has been active in explaining their new philosophy, or rather the philosophy they had for a while about this subject, and then now starting to become quite active about it, do something about it, which was the pulling back on the power of addons in combat situations, and wanting to limit quite a bit of the power of these addons, remove a whole lot of the functionalities they think are too invasive, and just simplify the game too much, as well as the idea of drawing some ideas from those addons to bring them into the default UI. We're talking about addons like Weakauras, like DBM or Bigwigs, or the detail damage meter, plater for your nameplates, and similar other combat addons. Now we have gotten even more detailed statements now, because we have gotten a new statement from the WoW developers in the WoW UI Discord. This is a Discord where a lot of the current, big addon developers reside. And that's where the Warcraft devs went to extend this other statement for the addon developers. Now, the first part of the statement is a whole slog about the timing being in the several months in terms of frame, how the project is still in heavy development right now, so we don't have specific technical details or precise dates. We will, of course, come out with detailed information and an actual timeline in the coming months. But they have come here to this UI Discord where other developers are in, because they want to share as much info as possible to make it easier for addon developers to adjust based on what Blizzard is planning to do with their API, what is gonna still be available to the addon developers to draw from the Blizzard API. Now, as for the first questionable sentence on this announcement, was that addons, as they provide a huge amount of value to our players, we have no intention of banning them outright. Now, this is quite counterintuitive compared to what we have heard in their previous couple of statements. There was definitely the clear intention of wanting to get rid of many of the functionalities of these addons. They have literally specifically stated just a few weeks ago that, for example, no group tracking abilities and group tracking of cooldowns was going to be available, no tracking of specialized buffs or debuffs on your frames or on enemies or targets' nameplates, as well as the removal of nameplates addons from being able, for example, to change things like the colors of the cast bars, the glows of the cast bars, or even sounds attached to certain casts of enemies. So this perhaps seems more like some kind of doublespeak, like, oh yeah, we are going to still allow plater to exist. We're not gonna ban plater outright. We're just gonna remove much of the functionality of plater. But in terms of actually banning the addon, no, we're not gonna do that. But functionally, it's gonna be about the same thing. It's like if they stopped API addons from being able to track the combat log to show a damage meter, and then they said, yeah, but we are not gonna ban details. Okay, but this way details will have anything to go by with the tracking of the damage and the healing and what else being stopped from being drawn by the addons. This is perhaps further explained when they say we are aiming to cause the least amount of collateral damage possible to addons when these changes go live. So however many things we are planning to make default into our UI, and however many things we think we have to remove from being available from addons, we can try to leave the functionalities of the rest of the addon intact, so you can still use them. Like, for example, in this good example of details, you could remove the damage done and the healing done being available from details, but you could still show things like interrupt, things like damage taken to see what someone died to, tracking the cast of abilities, so you get to see who casted what, for example, defensives or crowd controls, etc., to try to keep some of the functionalities of details, in this case, still intact. Now, what is perhaps the more worrying statement across all of this was when they point out that most of this functionality, most of these changes Blizzard plans to put out for their UI, most of this functionality will ship at the same time as these addon restrictions, if not sooner. This is quite worrying, because this reads, for example, like, yes, we are going to get rid Omni CD, so forget all of the tracking of cooldowns, defensives, externals, or DPS cooldowns from your frames. to try to include into our UI something similar, but Omni CC will be killed off like 3 months or 6 months before we even introduce the replacement for Omni CD, or we get to remove details or any other kind of damage meter, but it's gonna take you 3 months before we introduce our own damage meter, right? It's not that good to read that most of this functionality will ship at the same time, if not sooner. You definitely don't want to see these restrictions ship out sooner than when their alternative by Blizzard comes out live. In fact, you would rather see the opposite. You would rather see the ideal alternative from Blizzard be shipped a few months in advance, so you have time to give your feedback on how bad it is, how under-optimized it is, and how many things can be improved. So after a few months, perhaps it reaches some halfway decent state that you losing your beloved add-on you have used for years won't be nearly as bad now that the default version from Blizzard has been tweaked a little bit more. Now, they then repeat this concept about this type of changes not really being focused particularly around the race to world first mindset of wanting to basically reduce the amount of high-level, complex weak auras made, particularly for things like private auras or complicated mechanics that the very top of the cutting-edge guilds are going to come up with to progress the bosses when they are at their hardest. Their idea is to have this leveling of the playing field and making the game more approachable for all players. Since that you have this idea that since add-ons are able to analyze and solve combat and coordination mechanics perfectly and faster than any possible human player would be able to, this is putting players who are not using add-ons at a disadvantage. Players will end up feeling excluded from competitive content unless they install, set up, and maintain a number of different add-ons, which makes it a significant barrier of entry, might make players resent feeling like they have to have add-ons to play the game properly at a certain level. So the plan is to build the baseline functionality of the default UI to the point where even players without using add-ons would feel like they can approach certain competitive situations like Mythic Plus and the Raid without needing certain add-ons. Obviously, in order to make up for this, what also needs to happen is to make substantial changes to how Blizzard designs the combat encounters to accompany for these changes. This is one of the hardest points for players to go through. They hear, we are gonna get rid of Omni CD, we are going to get rid of Platers, spells on the nameplate or cast bar color changes. All of this to players just feels like or reads like it's gonna be much harder. Now I have to enter Mythic Plus without knowing when my DPS players are using the cooldowns. As a healer, when my DPS players, if my DPS players have a defensive cooldowns to use, I'm gonna have to pull this pack with all of the nameplates being red and all of their cast bars being yellow. I can't have the dangerous mobs turned purple, or the ones with the one-shot mechanics turned green, or the one that just spams. Machine gun spams the same void bolt colored orange, and their cast bars can't be changed based on, for example, red if my interrupt is on cooldown, green if I can interrupt the ability, or gray if the ability is uninterruptible. All of this help will go away. So obviously this will make it harder. This will make the key just factually harder if this functionality goes away. So Blizzard is planning to adjust, for example, these dungeons to keep in mind that players have lost some of their functionality, some of the knowledge they can get from the dungeon by these add-ons no longer having these features. And the same goes in the raid. Having to change some of the mechanics to make them more approachable without a Weakora, right? Now, in case you are confused, this can have very simple examples, things like imagine Smolderon. You had to use this macro Weakora because 3 red orbs are chasing you. You have to click them and then the Weakora was going to automatically order the 3 players, so you knew who was going to blow up the first orb, and then the second orb, and then the third orb. What if on Smolderon, instead of having 3 red orbs, you had the first one spawning being red, and then green, and then blue? Now, you don't need a Weakora. Now you know that the order you can go with is very simply red, green, and blue. and that is it. What if you're fighting Magzi and you have the Gauls, and you know that the first and second Gauls, you have one Gaul going left, the other going right, and then you have the one going far right, and then you have the final one with 4 Gauls, right? What if the player targeted by the Gaul, instead of having this generic brownish tint of the Gaul mechanic, the first Gaul was red, the second Gaul was green, the third Gaul was blue, and the last Gaul was yellow. This way you always knew which color went where. The red always goes left, the green always goes right, the blue always goes far right, and then the yellow is the last one in the 4 Gaul spawn. So at least you now know, based just on the color of the mechanic, where it is supposed to go without needing nearly as much help from a Weakora. And then the list goes on. You could have wondered, for example, why do we need to put markers on the pylons of Rick Reverb just to change their color so we know which pylon we are talking about? Well, Blizzard could have simply just made the pylons spawn in different colors, so you wouldn't need a Weakora about marking each specific pylon with a marker so you know which one you're talking about, so you know which one showing up in your frames is the one you're talking about when someone says green is full. Now you can just look at the map and see the pylon being green on the floor. And maybe even, why not, allow the default frames of the boss frames of Blizzard to actually be colored differently based on the color of the pylons spawning. This one would also minimize the use of a Weakora for that fight. That is kind of what they mean when they say things like these. After all, it is also something Blizzard did say, that the technical power of Weakoras forced them to add more and more mechanics such as lines, beams, swirlies, big, small, fast and slow swirlies chasing you around, because they are one of the few mechanics that they know Weakoras can solve. Those are only mechanics that you can solve with your feet. There's no amount of help you can get from a Weakora when you know a bunch of swirlies are chasing you on Galliwigs. You just have to dodge them. So perhaps now with the Weakoras being reined back in how much they can track and how much power can they have in helping you in an encounter, they can now design more mechanics that might have seemed completely trivial with the help of Weakoras. Now they can bring them back. Now the final point for this statement, which is also what is worrying players, is when Blizzard devs are saying if everything goes to plan, WoW will remain challenging, but the nature of the challenge will be less about managing the subtleties of class mechanics and more about collaborating with allies and interacting with encounters, rather than interacting with what an add-on is telling you to do. Obviously, there is still a lot of worry from the player base. Presumably none of this will be out and visible by the release of 11.2, and also likely not even by the release of the next expansion, possibly likely in the first patch of the next expansion. The players' worries, of course, are that either this fails dramatically because Blizzard clearly underestimates how hard they can make mechanics without a Weakora in mind, so bosses end up looking like Emerald Nightmare, raids dying in like 2 days on release, because the mechanics are not nearly as hard. Blizzard completely, overshoots how difficult things would have been without developing mechanics with Weakoras in mind, because, if you think about it, for the past 10 or so years, any combat design developer who has worked at Blizzard has developed encounters just with Weakoras in mind. So this would be probably a first with like 99% of the dev team to have to develop mechanics and think about mechanics without, the existence of Weakoras. Or perhaps the opposite, Blizzard completely overshoots the difficulty, and what happens is that with the functionality of the Weakoras removed, bosses become extremely hard. Every boss is basically the last 4 bosses of Sepulchre from boss 1. And it becomes far, far harder compared to what players are used to. It's just players have a hard time believing Blizzard will be able to strike the middle ground after many of the functionalities of these add-ons will be removed, to continue to keep the bosses and the raids in general very balanced. And then the same goes for Mythic Plus. Although, Mythic Plus can be bad, but perhaps never quite terrible, for the simple fact that Mythic Plus can scale forever. So, saying that Mythic Plus is too easy, well, it means that instead of capping at plus 20s, you will cap at plus 28s. Or saying that Mythic Plus is too hard, well, it means you won't cap at plus 20, you will cap at plus 15. But either way, you can keep scaling up or down in Mythic Plus, unlike the Raid, where that's the difficulty and that's not gonna change. Obviously, without any kind of timeline, without any kind of planned scheduling, and even any straight up mentions of what will go besides what we already know about, from the tracking, buff, debuff tracking, nameplates being much removed in functionalities, and the damage meter making it into the default UI. We still don't know much, we just have this extra layer of explanation given to Blizzard, which of course is still doing nothing to rest the anxiety of many of the players on how bad or how well this is going to turn out. You know, for most players that are already in this content, not what Blizzard is saying, the average player who isn't using add-ons and feels like he's being excluded from competitive content because he's not using an add-on, for the actual players in competitive content already, the majority of them are probably not seeing this having too much of a chance of being a straight-up win from Blizzard. Most players' reaction to this kind of idea from Blizzard is why we were living a happy life with Weakauras and with add-ons, plus we live in the year of the Lord 2025. It's not that complicated to just install a new add-on. It's always been one of the strengths of this game to allow such growth of the community of add-on developers in the game. So why should we restrict this, right? The last of the points, of course, when players keep wondering this is, oh, I know, it's for console, right? This is the only reason why Blizzard is doing this, why they are trying to level down the complexity of add-ons, and or rather increase the base value of the UI of Blizzard, because then they can release it for console. That's perhaps the bigger worry of many players right now, having resources taken away from developing actually important things in the game and having to throw them for the attempt at essentially consoleizing the game. So this was the latest statement from the Blizzard devs in regard to this plan, which will be a several months long plan. We will see whenever we have any news about this, a bit more detailed than what we've already been getting from these kind of a bit open-ended kind of statements. Then again, it's not that this statement in particular helped players, ease their mind and ease their worries about the possible dangers and the possible damages that will be caused by these several changes to our everyday add-on life in the game. But for today, on this Wednesday, and yet another reset in this 11.1.5 Season 2 patch of the game, we can now leave each other. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, oh my god, these birds chirping. At least if it was a funny tune, a nice melody. No, it's just a car alarm. It's very boring.